Hello. So in this lecture, I'm going to discuss the case of Cindy Gladue, who was an Indigenous person who was murdered in Canada. And the case of Cindy Gladue is a really disturbing example of violence against Indigenous women in settler Canada. So I will give a trigger warning. I will describe the case in detail, and it will involve graphic descriptions of the murder of Cindy Gladue, which involved egregious bodily harm to the victim who did die from injury. Um, And so it will involve graphic descriptions of violence against women and extreme bodily violence. In 2011, 36-year-old Cindy Gladue bled to death in a hotel bathtub in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Bradley Barton, a white man who worked as a trucker, had purchased her sexual services on at least two occasions, including the night she died. In 2015, Barton was tried for the murder of Cindy Gladue. The defense maintained that Cindy had bled to death from a tear that occurred during an episode of consensual rough sex when Barton inserted his fist into her vagina. And the trial involved ongoing discussions of whether Barton had actually inserted a knife into Cindy Gladue's body. Um, I want to discuss this case in relation to media representations of Cindy Gladue and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada, criminal law, denunciation and deterrence, eugenics and biopolitics, and the politics of visual culture. And my name is Tara Atluri, and I am a sociologist in Canada. Language is performative, it is not just mimetic. And so cultural theorists often discuss the ways that language is not simply a description of reality, it constructs reality. Judith Butler's work regarding gender performativity argues that gender itself is not a reflection of reality. Gender is not static or fixed. It is something that we constantly reiterate or repeat through ritual, through voice, through gesture. And performativity itself is about the power of language to do things. So when someone says, I promise, language is not just about reflections of reality. It doesn't just stand in for ideas. It does things. I promise, I declare you husband and wife. I declare you married. These are performative acts, and language does things with words. So, in the trial of Bradley Barton, in the first during the first trial, the judge and lawyers referred to Cindy Gladue as a native prostitute or a native sex worker or a native girl over 50 times. So Gladue was referred to as, quote, a native girl or a native prostitute over 50 times. Bradley Barton, accused of murdering Cindy Gladue, was never referred to as a white man. These posthumous trials are examples of systemic racism, and we can see similar examples in the murder of George Floyd. George Floyd, an unarmed Black American man, was murdered by the U.S. police, and in the trial of Derek Chauvin, a U.S. police officer, George Floyd is referred to as having counterfeit currency. So he is murdered and then referred to as having counterfeit currency. Cindy Gladue is referred to as a native prostitute. So these people are put on trial after they have been murdered, and this serves to exonerate those who are accused of killing them. Um, Cindy Gladue was not referred to as a human being or honored as a mother or a daughter or a friend or a worker. And this disgusted Indigenous and women's rights leaders. Thousands of people protested across the country to condemn the treatment of Cindy, and Bradley Barton's case had to go to the Supreme Court. So it is interesting to think about how language, both the use of images and the use of photos were used in the Gladue case to tell a certain story about Cindy Gladue and also to construct meaning about her murder. And the meaning is shaped by these performative uses of language and images. So this was the photo that was used of Cindy Gladue in the press after her murder. So the depiction of Cindy Gladue as smoking, as being addicted, serves to mark her as a certain class of persons. It also serves to use objects like addictive substances to construct Cindy Gladue as being, say, unhealthy or an addict. And Cindy Gladue is not shown in the media with her children or with her family members or with her friends. She is not referred to as a person who graduated from a certain amount of schooling in Canada or had a job. And Yasmin Jawani has discussed the ways that the Canadian media often depicts Indigenous women as victims of poverty, but also as addicts. And so this kind of victimization is also simultaneously about aggression, and Indigenous people, Indigenous women, are often depicted as criminals, as deviants, or as addicts. So Joani comments that Indigenous women are largely portrayed as abject victims. And this victimization is true in this kind of visual depiction. So the victimization does not have an aggressor. So the use of addiction and the use of the images of addiction and the stories of poverty never name an aggressor. So just as Cindy Gladue is referred to as, quote, a native girl or native prostitute, Bradley Barton does not exist as a white man. So we have victims and no aggressors. And so the victimization does not serve to implicate whiteness or colonial power or class structure. The rich, the white men, are never named as aggressors. They are never named as people who benefit from the suffering of others, who have caused the suffering of others, and then who financially profit from the poverty of others. And this is really how power works. Peggy Phelan uh, has written a book called The Politics of Performance, and Phelan argues that there is no more powerful position than being unmarked. When you are unmarked in your privileges. So one does not comment on the kind of healthy, the wealthy, the white, cisgender men. They are unmarked. They are the norm. They are the ideal. And so to be marked is to be subject to remarks, comments, insults, naming. And this power to name the other is colonial power. It is the power of uh, colonial knowledge production. Sandra Harding also discusses standpoint epistemology and the ways that one's standpoint, one's social location allows them to occupy a position in which certain commentary judgments seem normal. So if I locate myself as a woman of color who is born and raised in Canada, I occupy a certain position, and there are certain norms, attitudes, behaviors, ideas that seem normal to me. I'm not simply every person. I don't occupy a universal uh, position. This kind of positivist scientific rationale allows privileged people to claim an objective standpoint in which they can name and judge and ridicule and criminalize others. And so Sandra Harding, as a feminist theorist, is interested in the way that the male gaze has often masked itself as a position and the ways that men, cisgender heterosexual men, white American men, men in general, pass judgment or construct categories is not simply an objective position. It is the position of men. And Harding problematizes this by arguing that we all have a certain standpoint, and men are not simply all of us. They do not simply speak for all of us. They can represent themselves, like all of us, from a certain social location. Black feminist theorist Patricia Hill Collins draws on standpoint theory to discuss Black feminism as being located in the lived experiences of Black women, of Black people who experience both sexism and anti-Black racism. And this is a specific position. So Cindy Gladue was a Cree person, and taking photos of Cindy Gladue and representing Gladue as an addict, representing Gladue as poor, representing Gladue as somebody who is outside of the bounds of normal middle class civil society is an act of racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and colonial arrogance. Black British theorist Stuart Hall argues that language is not simply words. Languages are signs and signifiers. So a cigarette, for example, being smoked by this person, Cindy Gladue, means something. And it means something because of all of these other signs and signifiers. So the news media headline of a native sex worker who is murdered is coupled with this photo. If we saw a photo of a Parisian model smoking in Paris, obviously the cigarette would mean something else. So signs only exist in relation to other signs. So I'm wearing red lipstick. In the history of the suffragette movement, many women wore red lipstick as a mark of defiance against their lack of rights to vote. And red lipstick became a popular sign for suffragettes who were fighting for the right to vote as women. Um, Red lipstick in the fashion industry means something else. In Paris, for example, it's quite common for women to wear red lipstick, and red could also be part of French nationalism because it's one of the colors in the French flag. Um, Red is a sign that means many things to many different people. If we speak in the same language, if we operate in the same system of signs, red lipstick means the same thing to us. So if we understand the history of the suffragettes, then when someone wears red lipstick, we might think about it in relation to the suffragettes. If you've never heard about the suffragettes, you might just think red is a color of lipstick. It doesn't mean anything. If you have lived in a certain country, lipstick and makeup could be used to signify class position. In some contexts, a woman who could afford to buy makeup would be seen to be middle class. In other contexts, lipstick or makeup might be associated with the working class. The point is that these contestations over what signs mean are really about power, and they are about culture, and in some cases, they're even about life or death. So, what skin color means, what being a woman of color or an indigenous woman means to different publics and different counterpublics, to different generations of people, is about our constant sense of class antagonism and our battle over ideas, over history, over land, and our battle for power in society.